Some explosive revelations in those RCMP court documents released this week. Corporal Greg Horton believes that Senator Mike Duffy and Nigel Wright, the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, committed bribery, breach of trust, and fraud. But is there enough evidence to support charges? Where is the line between unethical behavior and criminal wrongdoing? Joining me now is someone who has great expertise in the fine print of parliamentary rules and the law, former law clerk of the House of Commons, Rob Walsh. Thanks for being here, Mr. Walsh.
Pleased to be here.
Let's break down some of the potential charges here so that people understand what sections of the criminal code we're dealing with, and then you can sort of, branch out into the parliamentary aspect as well if you want. Section 119 of the criminal code is one of the first that's mentioned. This deals with the bribery of judicial officers or members of parliament. It is when someone corruptly accepts or gives money in order to obtain valuable consideration in their official capacity. Could that be a potential charge for either Nigel Wright or Senator Duffy?
I don't think so myself, because it's complicated. You have to ask, let's first ask, where's the bribe? Ostensibly, the bribe is a $90,000 check. And who was that paid to? It was paid to Duffy, well, not directly, to his bank, and then eventually it enabled him to repay the Senate. Well, what would Duffy do for that in his official capacity? He was asked to not speak publicly. Well, that's not official capacity. Any senator can choose not to speak publicly. It's not his duty to speak publicly. So I don't see what he could be doing in consideration for the $90,000. Was the $90,000 intended to affect the process in the committee, so that the committee, once the Senate is reimbursed, would change the report or stop the audit? Well, now you're talking about a bribe to Duffy's bank to get the Senate committee members to, in their official capacity, do something different. That's a bit of a stretch.
Okay, so you think that allegation is a bit weak, is it?
I think so.
Okay, let's move to the next one, 121 of the criminal code. This one section deals with frauds on the government. Again, it's when someone gives or accepts money or a reward for cooperation or influence, and the deal is done without the consent from the head of the branch of government for whom this official works. Take us through this one.
Well, this one's an interesting provision. I have said before today, that in my view, Section 121, which is headed frauds on the government, doesn't apply here insofar as the Senate is not part of the government. I don't know why, frankly, they're spending as much time on 121. Nonetheless, Corporal Horton's affidavit would seem to be focusing on 121, and in his paragraph 58, where he finally concludes that Nigel Wright and Senator Duffy are committed fraud and breach of trust and bribery. Well, it's interesting, the language. It's almost like it's not an allegation, but you're right. Technically, it's an allegation.
Technically, it is.
Technically, it's an allegation, certainly, yes. But in any event, he cites in there the language, without the written consent of the head of the branch of government. Well, who's the branch of government here? PMO? Well, who's the head of the PMO? Prime Minister. Has the Prime Minister consented to this or not? Well, that's the big question that's happening in the House of Commons, of course. And the Prime Minister's not answering beyond what he said before about May 15th, that that's when he learned about the check. And I'm wondering if, in fact, in my own mind, I wonder, is he perhaps unable or feeling unable to go further in that regard, because it might impact on the possible criminal charges that may be laid against 121, because if, in fact, he consented, approved, knew what was going on, then there can't be any charges laid under 121 against Wright or Duffy, because they acted with the consent of the head of the branch of government.
Although he also says in that same affidavit, not to get too deep in the weeds, that it takes written approval.
Written, but that may mean evidence in writing. So the February 29th email about got the go from the Prime Minister may be taken by a court as sufficient evidence of a consent by the head of the branch of government. So I think the Prime Minister is in a very difficult situation here by virtue of the fact that he is the head of the branch of government. And I wonder, when I look at Corporal Horton's affidavit, has he spoken to the Prime Minister? If he has not, why not? If he has spoken to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister said he did not consent, that's a piece of evidence that should have been in the affidavit. That's a relevant piece of evidence.
So, but when you read this, do you think that he has spoken to the Prime Minister?
No, he's silent on that altogether. Yet in paragraph 58, he talks about needing the written consent of. Wouldn't you first of all go there? Because if the answer is yes, I gave consent, that's the end of 121. It doesn't apply.
We have one more section to get through, but do you think that Corporal Horton needs to speak to the Prime Minister?
I do, if he's relying on section 121.
Otherwise, he doesn't need to further interview him.
That only comes up with 121.
Okay, let's look at section 122 of the criminal code. This is what the RCMP documents allege in this regard. This applies when a public official commits fraud or breach of trust in connection with the duties of their office. What is your take under the likelihood that this could happen?
Well, if any section might apply to either Wright or Duffy, it's this one. I think probably that there isn't, when I read in Corporal Horton's affidavit, I don't see the basis for a charge against Nigel Wright under 122 in terms of fraud or breach of trust. It wouldn't be fraud, but it might be breach of trust. Well, his trust obligation is on behalf of the Senate, the Prime Minister. And what I think many people, observers of this whole affair don't understand. They think that, you know, this unsavory conduct where they're making a deal to avoid an audit being completed or to get a report changes is somehow, you know, illegal or whatever. That's politics. That's part of the relationship between the PMO and the Conservative leadership in the Senate. Same between the PMO and the Conservative leadership in the House.
So, but trying to influence or stop an independent audit from happening, there's nothing wrong with doing that?
No. Trying to influence the senators who have control of that to cause that to stop. I'm saying there may be nothing criminal about that. It's politics. But as we have some report of a senator going directly to the auditors, that may be a different story. But to talk to the PMO, to talk to the Conservatives in the Senate saying, listen, why don't you stop that audit because you got the money now, so what do you need it for? That sort of talk, that's trying to influence the process. They do it all the time. And it could happen in the House of Commons between the PMO and a committee report in draft form. It's just part of the process. That's not criminal. So I don't think there's on Mr. Wright's part, that there's a breach of trust there. He was doing what he's supposed to do on behalf of the Prime Minister, serve the Prime Minister's political interests. The Prime Minister's political interests, however partisan, are part of our democratic political system. They're not illegal, okay? Short of criminal behavior.
Right. So why do you think then that why do you think that they're focusing so much on Nigel Wright? You don't seem to think that there's any possibility of charges in regards to him because from your perspective, it's politics, business as usual.
I think
however unsavory as some might judge them to be.
I think they're focusing on Nigel Wright only because he's part of the scene. They couldn't not do that.
Sure.
So they have to include him. He's definitely part of what's going on here. And if only to rule out, they have to include him in their investigation. No question about that. And I'm not arguing with that at all. I just think at the end of the day, I don't see so far from Corporal Horton's affidavit the basis for laying charges against him under any of those three provisions. But what is not mentioned in there, and I don't know why, is Section 16 of the Parliament of Canada Act, where Nigel Wright could be put away for a year and fined for trying to influence a senator. Not fraud, not breach of trust, just influence a senator. What does that mean? I don't know of any prosecution under that section, but it's there. And yet it doesn't seem to be getting any attention as a possible
And is it
avenue.
Criminal, though? Is that something the RCMP would investigate themselves?
Well, it's an imprisonment. I mean, generally speaking, any provision that has an imprisonment provision with it is thought to be a criminal matter.
It's interesting to listen to you because you're a former law clerk, but yet you seem to read this and believe that a lot of it was just sort of normal politics.
I think there's
a lot of Canadians would be surprised to hear you say that.
Because a lot of Canadians don't know how politics in this country works out in terms of parliamentary politics, the back and forth between parties and so on. Don't forget, the PMO is in the House. And so it naturally has a working relationship with the Conservative majority of the House. It wouldn't be there if it didn't. And so also with the Conservative majority in the Senate. And they work to serve their political interests. That's par for the course, short of criminal conduct, of course. And I don't think that there's anything shown by Corporal Horton here of a kind that indicates criminal behavior or criminal intent. I mean, think about it. Nigel Wright, a wealthy man, and we have reports that he's an honorable man, a moral man, an ethical man. He's going to get into criminal behavior through a lawyer, and the lawyer involved, the lawyer for Senator Duffy, very well-regarded lawyer in a very well-reputed law firm. She's not going to go near anything that smells of any criminality. So it just doesn't make sense if you back up a minute and look at this. I think he's got to investigate Wright. I don't argue with that. But I just don't see it here as credible that he could be effectively charged and prosecuted and convicted of any criminal offense.
Okay, you mentioned the lawyers. A lot of people have raised eyebrows at the conduct of the lawyers negotiating this deal. There were ultimately three of them, a party lawyer, a PMO lawyer, and Mr. Duffy's lawyer. Is there anything there that would have been untoward from what you've seen? Now, the way you're describing it now, I'm starting to think that I don't know why we're reading it at all.
Well, you might well ask why we're here in terms of what decision the RCMP made at the beginning about investigating this. But leaving that aside, yes, I think there's a potential for some serious problems for the lawyers here, serious in the professional terms. Sure. That is to say, their law society, their governing law societies have rules about ethics and behavior and in respect of legal matters that you carry out on behalf of your client. And, you know, leaving aside criminality, I'm not suggesting for a moment these lawyers are party to criminality, but certainly if a lawyer acting for a client, never mind sister-client privilege, if he's participating in advancing criminal conduct, he's got a criminal problem. But apart from that, if he has reason to believe what's going on, or the representations being made on behalf of his client, or he's being asked to make representations on behalf of his clients that are wrong, false, designed to mislead, well, he can't participate in that. I'm not suggesting these lawyers did that. No. I'm just saying that that's the kind of issue. The lawyers have got to keep themselves clean of being implicitly involved in what you might call unethical conduct.
So is there any basis for any criminal wrongdoing in the allegations you've seen on anybody's part at this stage?
Well, going beyond Corporal Horton's affidavit, I think from what we've known publicly, there may be some, Senator Duffy may have some problems.
In relation to fraud?
In relation to his expenses. Yeah, this report here, I think, is largely all about the $90,000 check from Wright to Duffy. But there may be problems for Senator Duffy and perhaps also Senator Wall, and I don't know, or Senator Harb. We'll see. But in terms of the $90,000 check, as unsavory as it might be, it may not pass the smell test for many Canadians, because once you see a large amount of money moving, all of a sudden you think, my goodness, there must be something going on here that's not legal. Well, it may not be kosher in the minds of many Canadians. It may not even be, terribly ethical. But it's the action of a political nature where the Conservatives, whether you like them or not, are seeking to protect their brand from damage by closing down the Duffy file. And all the parties seek to protect themselves against damage to their brand. Nothing unusual about that.
But the quid pro quo nature of it, the fact that it was $90,000 in return for something, there were conditions attached to the money, that doesn't raise eyebrows for you?
In return, well, you have to look at those conditions. That doesn't cost me a nickel, said Duffy. Okay, that's why the money was produced. Okay, because he felt he was not in any wrong. That you don't say anything publicly. He has no duty to say anything publicly.
That you also don't take my Senate seat from me at any point. That was also one of them, allegedly.
Well, I'm not aware of that one and what form that took. I mean, he can't control that, you know what I mean? Yeah. So if you get money, it's because you're being asked to do something within your official capacity. That's not something he controls. So I think that there's questions to be asked, certainly, and Corporal Horton is asking those questions and getting some answers. But there's some glaring questions that he hasn't asked, and I would look forward to his next report, because clearly for yourself, Rosemary, and others in your field, this is a gold mine of information and facts and details that the media are enjoying immensely, and it's a great story. It's a great story, no question. But how much of it is relevant to a successful legal prosecution, I'm not sure.
Rob Walsh, always good to talk to you. Appreciate your perspective today. That, of course, is a former law clerk of the House of Commons, Rob Walsh.